Well, now let's move on to the main portion of our meeting. I'd like to introduce our inside track speakers. Their firm is taking intellectual work to the next level. And the name of their company is ThinkOutcomes, the creators of cloud technology called Wisdom, and their solution offering called Wisdom Command Center. What if business could solve problems faster, remain open-minded, and park bias? These are human, relationship, and cultural issues that represent the largest productivity, effectiveness, and efficiency challenges. Organizations are complex human systems with complex human dynamics. You see these dynamics in supply chain relationships and demand chain relationships across organizations as well. ThinkOutcomes was founded by Larry and Neil Smith, who are identical twins. Their roots are in business operations, management consulting, and enterprise technology. Their connection is what made the founding of their company possible. ThinkOutcomes enables human minds with software built for the way people think, communicate, advise, make decisions, and recall information. It is a neuro-platform company that manufactures software solutions to improve how human minds receive and process information. The company provides the missing software frameworks and data processing engine to gain mental clarity for the trade-offs needed to make sense of the complexities. It's even more challenging when stress exists. That's when mental states tend to traverse the spectrum of complexity, which includes clarity, ambiguity, uncertainty, instability, volatility, and chaos. As emotions and gut reactions supplant critical thinking, each progressive mental state throws logic and objectivity out the window. This human issue exists in business because professionals don't have a way to manage their emotional and cerebral behaviors when their mental models are challenged. You'll see this when they are presented with new ideas for positive change. During these times, they stand steadfast and negotiate their positions. Professionals need a way to learn about their unknowns rather than not knowing how to deal with them. How do you resolve the meetings of the minds? These two young men believe they can help. Ladies and gentlemen, here are Larry and Neil Smith. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, John, for the introduction. Thanks, everybody, for being here as well. As John said, this whole thing was born truly by having the life of an identical twin. Neil, do you mind sharing your screen?
Sure.
And we took this experience to figure out, as an identical twin, and then in the breakout room we were in earlier, I shared with some people, I said, as an identical twin, it's easy for your identical twin to question you all day long, right? And then you actually have a responsibility to own that questioning and make sure you actually deliver. We've been doing it since we've been kids, almost on a 24/7 basis, but literally 7 days a week. So when's the last time someone actually asked you, how do you do your critical thinking? And how do you formulate your messaging and critical speaking? And consultants, most consultants in the world today are doing process consulting. I'm a former Arthur Andersen consultant. Used to work at KPMG as well, but before Andersen. So process consulting, strategy consulting, operational consulting, management consulting, if you will. People have not done a lot of what we call neuro management consulting. Is go inside the brain of people and see how are you making these decisions? What are you actually doing? What systems are you using? And we, by going back and forth forever, we actually developed software systems to actually allow people to critically think better and critically speak better. And no one taught us, taught anybody how to do this really. Once you go beyond undergraduate school, then you kind of learn on the job and maybe you get your MBA, but after that you're on your own, especially when you have organizations that are all different types of talent. and you're trying to manage these different mindsets, no one can peer inside the eye or behind the forehead, if you will, and see how someone's making the decisions. And when you can't do that, what happens? There's a lot of risk that happens in an organization. You're hoping and praying things will actually work in a certain way. You're in concert together, if you will. You're on the same ship, rowing in the same direction, but it doesn't happen a lot. And we actually all experience what we call VUCA, volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. There's actually a process for critical thinking, a big process too that Neil and I broke down, very detailed. We'll keep it at somewhat of a high level for here. But when you think of your own critical thinking, what do? We're going to go into a case study in a second. And we welcome anybody's questions via the chat, or if you want to speak up, great, and apply your own situation to this. We're going to talk about COVID in a second, how this all relates to it and what happened in the breakdown a bit. But if you think about critical thinking, we all try and, like when you're listening to someone, like you're doing now, you try and frame it. You're trying to do a mental image in your mind. You're trying to paint things. And then when you're getting this little bit of a scaffold of your paint, you're trying to add some more dimensions to it, a little more oil painting and make it your own. And you say, I understand. And then that's just the interpretation part of things. And then you actually have to now go down into it and take the information you have, combine it with other information you already know, and now try and formulate, how do I actually articulate this to someone else? There's a process for all this. And how do you, what mental models do you reference or recall, or how do you reason your logic? And how do you actually, again, interpret the logic and then therefore speak about it? And when you actually are able to articulate it, that's when you really have it solidified or more solidified. It's a challenge for everybody in the world. It permeates every industry. That's just about critical thinking. Then we talk about critical conveyance or speaking. We talk about decision-making, collaboration, once you have more than one person involved, two or more as a team, and it gets really complex. And so if you imagine what's going on in your businesses or how consultants can help clients manage their success in business, it's in essence, these are the two major skills that are very much in demand. And unfortunately, not a lot of people have this process down. It's so essential to success. It actually can transform an organization from where they are to where they want to be. The recall, how do people recall? Today, people talk about artificial intelligence. This is actually natural human intelligence. Neil and I talk about the crust, the boulder in the water. The crust above the water is AI, artificial intelligence, using explicit data. The boulder in the water, if you will, covered by the water, is all our human intelligence. How do we get to that human intelligence and make it visible? Neil and I spent years in trying to figure out how to make people's thought processes in business, visible. So we ended up accomplishing that through software. It was very challenging, and all these core tenets to do that. It leads to advisory, leads to monitoring outcomes, monitoring uncertainty, and how to control and comply with certain processes. Neil, can you go to the next slide? So you're probably very familiar with meeting rooms, and it doesn't have to be all professionals. It could be all different walks of life, different professional designations, and different professional experiences. Not everybody's necessarily in suits and ties. But you do have subject matter experts. You do have decision makers or teammates or compliance officers or advisory people. You have communication experts, marketing experts, and the list goes on of different people of what they're trained in. And over time, what happens is the grooves of the brain, if you will, start to form. Again, this neural management aspect. And we all get trained a certain way, but at the same time, what's happening is we're not getting trained in other ways. And so how do we combine and gain that experience from others and gain the key phrases, keywords, perspective? What we don't know what's happening behind the forehead is under the person under the side that's highlighted at the moment, is like people may be uncertain, or they may be having ambiguity in their mind under the think gentleman, or they're clear under the advised gentleman, or they're clear, uncertain. It goes from clear, there's a process for this. We start off with clarity. Imagine a circle, you're going around it. You go to ambiguity. Once there's ambiguity in your ability to execute, you're moving to a fragile position. And if you don't get clarity and time marches on, and a lot of other variables come into play, and you have time pressure to make a decision, you may move to uncertainty. Then you may move to instability or unstable. And then as more people join the mix or more variables change in the market, wherever it is, it becomes volatile. And finally, and not a lot of people reach this stage, but it does happen, as COVID showed us, it becomes chaotic. How do you move back up around that circle, back to clarity? We all want to stay at clarity. If we're at clarity, we maintain control. Everyone wants control. Everyone wants certainty and decisiveness, to understand how they're going to manage these decisions. This all sounds intangible, but it's very real for all of us today in how we do our businesses and how we advise people in business as well. People aren't on the same page. Happens all the time. We expect people to say, do you understand what I'm saying? People say yes. But the truth of the matter is, tell me, articulate yourself back to me to make sure I actually understand what you mean by yes. Decision cycle's slow because people aren't getting it all the time. People aren't necessarily thinking out of the box, and they're not. So innovation is slowed down. How do we break through those cerebral barriers? When you think about a company, people think of two major pieces to it. Take the roof off the house of the business. You have compliance and transactional, so credit cards, accounting, et cetera, compliance, regulatory, et cetera, as we know. There's a third piece here that no one talks about. It's cerebral. It's said differently. It's cognitive or cognition. And there's a lot of people who think for a living. They're not doing the transactional work. So when you focus on those cognition people, how do we actually know what they're doing? Is there a process for that? What do we do? Culture, on the third bullet here. It's getting people down. People get frustrated with how people communicate with each other. They get fatigued, zoomed out, right? They get meeting fatigue. They're tired of seeing these things. And they want to feel like they're part of the inertia here. They got to get connected. Negotiations are very complex in how people can actually connect to one another. And they don't understand, how do you come up with that decision? How many times have you said to yourself, silently, what were you thinking about? How many times have you said to yourself in different ways, how do you come up with that decision? How many times have you never heard people asking you ask the same question about yourself? This is a humongous opportunity in consulting to help people manage their VUCA, their volatility, their uncertainty, their complexity and ambiguity. And so they don't move around that circle. How many times do people go through this? Happens every day, thousands, millions of times, billions of times a day, depending on how many thought processes you have. They're all miniature cycles. We talked about people not feeling engaged. Let's talk about COVID a little bit. What happened there? What's the everybody, we all can relate to this. What happened with COVID? Think of a client who's impacted by COVID. Think of what COVID, we don't have to start in the beginning. Well, know the beginning, at least we think we know. None of us were probably there, but it happened in the lab, supposedly. That's at least what we hear. And then it just permeated. Even today, we're still trying to manage it with the Delta variant as well. But all of the decision implications in the world of one thing or another implicates the next thing. So I'm going to say it differently. It's who was the process owner in this process? And who were the stakeholders of this process? So if we take off the label in the traditional organizations of CEO, CFO, COO, et cetera, and create in the organizational structure, although good for reporting, is technically broken. Okay, Neil and I actually broke this. Wait a minute. When you actually have your ego all the way down, as you do in an identical twin life, you're saying, Neil is a stakeholder of me, I'm a process owner, and vice versa, can switch at any point in time. So if we use the phrase stakeholder and process owner and leave it there, don't have reporting relationship fine for CEO, CFO, et cetera, but leave it there. We can switch roles, that's great. The question is, who has the information and the insight, and who should be listened to about that particular topic at that moment in time? Like I said before, COVID is dramatically impacting all of our daily lives. It permeated all of business, permeates all of the news. What happened was, what was going on in the critical thinking? What was going on in the critical speaking? Why didn't other people understand and act sooner? Why aren't we getting it today? You can turn on the news today and see issues going on. What's going on? How are people using their mental frameworks to critically think? Are they deep enough in that subject matter? You may be excellent in one domain, but you move 1 degree away or 2 degrees away, it's very different. And then you can't critically speak about it. Or when you're critically speaking about it because you're excellent in that domain, the next person's not getting it. So if you can show your thoughts visibly, if you will, you neutralize that understanding, and you now have a visible way to shorten that learning curve dramatically. You do leapfrogs. We use the word catapult. There's a catapult program you can go through to understand how to get your thoughts across so quickly. But then imagine, we use the phrase wisdom command center or wisdom. Imagine being able to collect all the wisdom, the correlations of how people think, and make it bonded, if you will. So if I'm the CEO of an organization, I need information in a moment. Let me go the other way first. I'd need it today. What do? I just get all this random spreadsheets. I get all this stuff. It's like overwhelming, way too much. I'm like, okay, I got my experience. I'm making a decision. And risk happens on the organization. It happens to those stakeholders and those processors. But if I could actually see, go ahead, Neil.
Let's look at COVID-19 for a second. We look at this from a citizen's perspective. We're all citizens of the U.S. here, and think about what decisions you went through. You can, later on, we can remove it from a citizen's perspective. Think about it as an employee or some contribution in an organization or in a workforce. But even from a citizen's perspective, you look at what were you thinking? What did you speak about with your friends and family? What were you getting from the news? We heard the scientists say, and we're saying to ourselves, where's the data? How is it being presented to us? Is it being presented at all? Or we just keep relying on whatever the news says? And we know that media sources are different. So this is the same as happens in organizations too, where people that are accountable for decisions and results and eventually outcomes need evidence, and they have to see the logic, see your thinking that's going on. And that's not happening today. Where the investment has been in the whole transactional side of the business with these great systems, ERPs, from SAP, Workday, everybody over there. But the people on the front end of the decision process, the people that are trying to make these trade-offs around the complexities they deal with, because it's only increasing, it becomes challenging. So this thing about how we think critically, how we speak critically is so important, because decision cycles are slowing down and especially as more and more stakeholders come into the decisions process. So let me ask you, maybe some thoughts. What were you thinking, or maybe what you heard? It doesn't have to be a personal story unless you want to share that. But what were you thinking around the coronavirus when you were making a decision one way or the other, or how you communicate with your family or friends?
I just took sources that I felt comfortable about their credibility and used that, and then basically stayed home, and I just told everyone, mask up, stay home. I'm on the vaccine route trying to get everyone vaccinated, and still have family members that are holdouts. So
Which certainly makes it challenging to know that family members have different thoughts about this. It's the same in teams, in businesses. It's like they have different thoughts. Some people are unclear because they have their own mental model that's going on, and they haven't gotten the sources like you talk about to say, this is, I validated it, I understand, I can make a decision on that. Anybody else?
One comment to that, Neil. Mary Beth, that's interesting too. So I think lots of families across the nation, across the globe, have different views and different perspectives whether to get the vaccine or not, for instance, on how they make their decisions. But it's like, show me the evidence, let me understand, versus just the expert who claims to be the expert, if you will. We want to actually understand, and we have to say these magic words in our head. This makes sense to me. And if you can't get there, then decision cycle slows. You can't do anything. You may be stalled, or you may just go forward with groupthink.
I think
Neil and I often talk about, I'm sorry, go ahead.
I think you're also talking about people who are making decisions based on their own critical thinking, but not everybody is like that. You have a lot of people who say, well, I believe everything that this guy says, so whatever he says is what I'm going to follow. So there is a very large population of people that essentially does not do the critical thinking, it just believe.
Right. And it's so important, though, right, to break through those barriers. If you just accept, and there's a lot of people you can accept, right, because they've been so trained or educated in a certain area. But if you just accept and you're not actually being your own, critical thinking partner to yourself, then you don't even offer a different perspective per se. And you're like, I should break through that. And to offer, even contribute to that conversation in an intelligent way. And actually, like we talk about pharma quite a bit and saying the timeline, COVID was a separate issue, right, for the vaccination, but most drugs take so long. They took 14 plus years to create a drug with billions of dollars. There got to be a better way to shrink that cycle. And all these other decisions that are made in business that go across the board. Don?
Yeah, I guess one of the questions I've got is, who can understand messenger RNA, for example? To dig in and understand it to the level where I would be able to say, yes, I understand. It seems like the higher the level of complexity, the less likely individuals, especially us lay people, are going to be able to do that. So at that point, other than figuring out which expert to trust, how do we apply critical thinking to that situation where the complexity is so great? I don't have the time, the energy, the knowledge, the bandwidth to be able to become an expert in vaccines, in messenger RNA, in all that complexity. Feels like I'm relegated to expert trusting, which makes me nervous.
And also, I guess if I may add to that, is there is a conscious effort of mixing misinformation and disinformation together with the information. So there are, I'm not trying to, say, one organization does it or the other, but, they basically try to, do the negative publicity on a conscious basis. So what do we people do?
I guess
we still decide who to trust.
Right, Turi, to my point, I can filter those out when I look at the source, but I've got honest doctors that have positive intent that are really trying to educate and really trying to help, and they have the best intent to help, and yet they have opposite or opposing viewpoints. So who do I trust?
So can I comment there for a second? Don, both excellent commentary. Don, to address your question, so I'm not a technical expert in COVID either, right, or vaccinations, pardon me. But if someone can define the process at more of a layman's terms, because we can all follow, a thing that comes to mind is like, how do we make eggs, right? At one point, we didn't know how to do that, right? But we also learned the process. Some make them better than others, right? But it's like, there's a process for this. There's a process for everything, just about. And if there isn't, definition has to exist. And if people can't critically think in a process format or critically speak, right, you may be able to be the best critical thinker on the planet. But if you can't critically speak, then it kind of dies in the vine. But if you can translate that into a process steps, and isolate that into the right level of process, if you will, and then bring people along, maybe if you're on the news, wherever it is, and you're saying, here's process step 1, 2, 3, 4. The methodology is key to say, I like the methodology. It's robust and reasonably defined. Now let's break it into its process steps. And I see the data behind the process of how you arrived at your decision. And to Tariq's point around maybe it's bad stuff coming in the mix, if you will, but we have people verifying the data. Then we can start to trust. Then we say, this makes sense to me. Without that, though, in a organized and systemized fashion, we're all still in the same place we've been for the last, umpteen, 20, 30, 40, 50, or beyond years. There's no way to capture this. That's what Neil and I have been focusing on for a long time.
But it seems like you're still left with trusting, A, that their process is legitimate and robust, B, that they, I mean, I can come up with a process for making a drug too. It doesn't mean it's a good process. I can explain it, I can understand it, but it doesn't necessarily mean that what I get at the end of it is going to be safe, effective, all the rest of that. So I love the process idea, and I can understand the process, but I'm still left with the question, does it do what it says it's going to do? Is it valid and reliable? And is it going to, cause any adverse side effects? Do you have 10-year data? Oh, you don't have 10-year data. Okay. Do you have 5-year data? You don't have 5-year data. Do you have any data on the longitudinal impact? Well, no, you don't. Therefore, why should I trust you that this won't have any negative long-term side effects?
Yep, excellent point. So scope is key, right? And as we all know, no single person, or let alone small team or even a bigger team, can define everybody's body type and what's going on. So the ramifications can be wild. Even if it's a small sample size, it could still create a cataclysmic effect. So how do we've talked about this a long time ago when COVID started happening, the vaccine started happening, how do you manage the scope on the impact you want to have? And can we start with the right key word here, profile? So can we get homogeneous profiles to have the right scope so we can test it in those profiles only, and then go for our rollout schedule, if you will, in vaccinations in this example? How do I go to the next level of my rollout for the right profile? Because I've proven within 9.5% confidence level that I can actually execute seamlessly with capability. And your topic about process, you're right, I won't know if that's a good process, maybe too technical for me around COVID. But if I have not groupthink, but enough experts around the world and non-experts, though, to actually get that process defined properly so the masses, the globe, understands this is the process, and don't necessarily talk techno speak, right? But talk normal speak and say, and here's the data. I'm not going to talk about certain genomes or whatever. I can't understand that stuff. I'm going to talk about, in layman's term, the implications of when this happens, the ink and the ointment, what's the implication? And give those analogies and show the data then where the experts are supporting that. Again, scope and homogeneity of profiles, then rollout is critical.
So the thing is, we're talking about how people make sense of situations, no matter what role they're in. Because I can, take anybody from this group, for example, take you out of your role and put you in a whole other role. You still have your human elements with you. You still have your ability to make sense of situations. You're a smart person. You bring your computer on top of your head with you. But we're limited as people, unfortunately, as much as we may or may not want to admit it, that our brains can only process, you might have heard the 7 plus or minus 2 variables at one time. So let's say maximum of 9 variables. And businesses aren't 9 variables. There are a lot of changing variables constantly, all the time, especially when you add VUCA to the mix, right? So how do you deal with that? And how do you deal with this level of trust? You want to get that trust. But how do you make sense of situations? Because everybody makes sense of situations differently because they have different mental models. If you can unify that, not to take away the creativity, keep the creativity, keep your expertise, all that stuff. You keep your gut, but not as a decision source, but as a signal, as an additional signal. That helps you move things forward because everybody needs objectivity. People need the evidence to support it. People need the questions to go and to challenge it. How do you ask the right kind of questions versus, great, we're done. It's like, and you look in hindsight, then you've got to go through the decision process all over again, which is a problem, So you want to avoid those things. You want to make the right decision the first time around because it's a very costly effort for an organization to get those people together. Maybe they've already executed a decision and all this activity happened downstream. Well, that's certainly a lot more costly, depending on how far it goes, into the downstream effort. And realize that, geez, we did something wrong. Do we admit it? Do we cover it up? What happens? How do we speak to our investors about it or any other stakeholders? This whole process, this whole cycle becomes challenging because organizations are made of complex human systems. We have to look at ourselves as a connected network of a complex system, and no one's solved this problem yet. We've even seen, the IT companies solving the data problem. Fantastic, and a lot of other systems out there for the application world, but not for human thinking, human speaking, critical advising, resilient decision-making, recall, proper multivariant compliance, multi-stakeholder issues, multidimensional issues.
And part of the
Sorry,
process too, and part of the process too is sorting out risk as quickly as, I mean, that's got to be right up front. Probably has been since we, stood up right. And in terms of knowing what you do know, what you don't know, and what's the risk involved with what you don't know, and sorting out the level of risk you're willing to take and how you perceive that risk, which I think fed into some of the decisions around the vaccinations versus not vaccinations, et cetera. We know what COVID does. We're not sure about what the vaccination does, but I got to trade off those two risks. Which one do I want to pursue? And then that's the one I go with. That's the
Exactly. Can we take that for a second? Can we take that for a second, Frank? Excellent point. What do you do? Like, we all do the same thing because there's a process for critical thinking, critical speaking.
Mm-hmm.
Your risk has to be defined at the end of the day in terms into your mental math, your data.
Mm-hmm.
You're making some type of mental math decision process, and you're doing these risk-reward trade-offs. But if you don't have good data, you can't go down that path, but you may listen to someone else and say, okay, I'll go with that direction, maybe because of time constraints, whatever it is. So I want to ask you a question, everybody question. What infrastructure do you have to help you grow your thinking process? We have Oracle, SAP, et cetera. That's excellent for transactional side. We have other regulatory stuff for compliance side, but for your speaking process, especially for, with all due respect, the introverted people who may not be extroverted or as extroverted as much. It's always a leniency for everybody, and I respect it all. But how do we get people who are super smart and introverts or extroverts to actually do the critical thinking and do the critical speaking and be motivated to see how that connective tissue happens? We all have it. We actually all do have it, every one of us. But we have to nurture it. And we actually have to, if I could actually see my own thoughts, which I kind of can through Neil, but not literally, I can only see my own thoughts, I can work with it. And then I can actually start to mold it before I actually share with someone else.
So I'd like to just tap into Frank for a second, if you don't mind, Frank, because you have a manufacturing supply chain background. Maybe other people do as well here. But you're used to things like cash to collection cycles and a lot of other issues that you deal with. But in the mind and the cost in business performance, I want you to think about this kind of stuff. Time to understanding, error rates in human synthesis, error rates in judgment, error rates in misunderstandings, errors in interpretation, speed in processing integrated topics, speed in connecting the dots, something about your relationships and experiences here. Time to insights, time to foresights, integration of perspectives. I'll just mention 4 other ones. Quality of output, quality of handoffs, time to solutions, and time to mental clarity. When you think of that for yourself or others, you're on a spectrum of novice to expert. And the team is as strong, high-performance teams are as strong as they are on that spectrum. Because if it turns out, let's say, my time to understanding on a given topic isn't as strong as yours, for example, now we're at the lowest common denominator. You got to, pull me up to help me out, to bring the whole group along, which isn't very fair to everybody else because I don't have that level of expertise or subject matter knowledge. The consistency to focus on a critical path way of doing things to connect strategy to execution outcomes is what we're talking about. And it's hard enough to connect strategy to execution. Execution outcomes is very challenging because we can't foresee, we don't know what the future looks like, but technology helps us get there because we can start to use data as our benefit to find out how to connect it to the future state.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry, Frank, were you going to say something?
No, I'm listening. That I agree.
Neil, I want to add one thing to that. Frank, I have a manufacturing background as well. So we applied all manufacturing principles to what we do. And so you talk about yield, et cetera, inventory controls. The mind is no different. It's like we actually all have a manufacturing process all built into this computer on top of our shoulders. Mm-hmm. We just break it down and think about the process steps that we go through. And all due respect, at least for myself, the capacity constraints I have and the finite understanding I do have about the entire world. It's like, well, how do I actually enrich that? How do I actually produce better quality output?
Mm-hmm.
Well, and I think, Frank, you brought up a really good point too, because when fear starts to take over, like with the vaccine versus the actual disease itself, we know with functional MRIs, the activity in your frontal lobes basically ceases. In other words, fear pokes your amygdala, you stop thinking. So trying to think critically while you are in the midst of fear, that's really tough. So I think to Neil and Larry's point, you've got to have your systems established before you hit in that fear zone, because you're going to be reacting. You're not going to be proactive. So you've got to pull the trigger on those systems before you get into that fear state. And I think that's what happened with a lot of people is they were in the fear state and they started making decisions. And that's how we got into a lot of the mess that we're in. So we've got to get fear under control so that we can get the frontal lobes re-engaged and start thinking again. It's impossible to think critically without your frontal lobes, right? And we're wired where it's physiology. The amygdala keeps us alive, which is great, but it's not ideally suited for critical thinking. Our pulse goes up. It's a physiological reaction. And unfortunately,
Exactly.
fear is the trigger, and COVID triggers a lot of fears on both sides.
Another thing,
And stresses.
And stresses.
Yeah, I guess another thing that is kind of a corollary to this is I know some people personally. First of all, I lost my father to COVID, so it was a real.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, thank you. But it was. I know that it is real, and I know several people who essentially said that they're not going to get vaccinated, but a couple of them that I'm talking about got the COVID. At that point, they said, give me anything. Okay, so this fear thing was before, they were not sure of whether take the drug or not take the drug. But when they were in that situation, it just changed it. The dynamics changed, and they said, give me anything because I want to live. So I think that fear thing is before the fact, not when it happens, it changes that.
Yes.
Totally agree.
The opportunity for, I'm sorry about your dad. The opportunity for managed consulting is to not only be able to think critically and speak critically, because you are the ones that can help bring people out of the pandemic. It's also, and lead, but also think about how you can get your clients to do the same. Think critically and speak critically, because they're the ones that own the results. They're the ones that are accountable, and that's where we changed management consulting into what we call neuro management consulting, where you're really helping the executive or whoever you may be working with, let's say the client, find a way to learn the skills, learn the frameworks. You leverage data effectively through software so they can do the job themselves. Whether you do it for them and they consume and say that makes sense, or they have other people doing it for them. But when you do that, what happens is management consultants can elevate their capabilities and do a lot more great work versus getting stuck in what the business needs to do right now, which is a lot of the minutia. And becomes that much more valuable because you're actually making advancements for the organization and providing them, frankly, a competitive advantage.
Mm-hmm.
The other part of it, too, is that you start to become integrated into their business model even more for the long tail. Any other thoughts about COVID? Experiences or thoughts on critical thinking, critical speaking, decision-making, advisory?
I have a question. I noticed that the more, personality tests or different mechanisms I take or learn about to understand who I am as a person, what my style is, all of these things we've been through with DISC and many iterations on that. Is this part of what you've built? Is there an amount of input of factors about each person on a team, for example? Because I've found that fascinating when a whole team is taken an assessment and you get results that show you, well, so-and-so thinks very differently from you. And so here's how you might interact with them. Is this built into the software at all, or am I just guessing at this point?
It's an excellent question, frankly, that we've addressed before, which is the personality tests. I've taken them before many years ago, as you know, the DISC questions and stuff. What does it do for you afterwards? You know, like, great, I can kind of interact with those people. I can kind of put them in a category. I know, you know, what they're like. But then how do you achieve results with them? What we'll do is one of the first things we do is we actually can do an assessment of their entire operating model to look at what they're using, not just for their technology, because this is what they're doing in their brains, right? They have a people, process, technology operating model they're working with. Most people use Microsoft Office, right? Between, you know, Excel, PowerPoint, Word, and Outlook, that's the common thing. To read, write, communicate, you know, think, you know, consume, interpret, synthesize, make decisions, and there's a lot of blind spots because of it. You know, and then what is their mental model in doing that stuff? So we actually do an evaluation of where they are to see where you catch them in their maturity curve. Relative, we talked about the cognition maturity model. You know, how can we advance them up? When you do that across a team, whether it be like-minded or heterogeneous-minded professionals, you bring them back together again. You said now they're all in the same kind of understanding. You can bring them to a high-performance team, which is our next level of interaction with them. So it's a two-stage process that we talk about as the Catapult program. So the personality test only gets you so far, but it doesn't let you enable you to do your work more effectively. You know, it lets you to do some level of interaction, but not necessarily your hard work more effectively that you need to be accountable for and frankly put your personal brand on.
Thank you.
And I guess I'd add to that, Jen, I think and I don't know if it's part of the model, but one of the ways that I'll use the personality tests is great. It's self-awareness, but it's also others' awareness. And Larry, you were talking about the systems. What systems do you put in place to help grow your thinking? That's one of the systems. So if I know, for example, DISC or MBTI or any of the other ones, I know my style is this, but I know Bob's style is completely opposite. And Bob just thinks completely differently than I do. So when I'm wrestling with something, I'm going to use my lifeline. I'm going to phone a friend. I'm going to call Bob because Bob is going to challenge my thinking. He's going to make me think better than I currently think because Bob thinks differently than I do. So, you know, knowing the DISC, knowing the MBTI actually does aid in my thinking, but you're absolutely right. The test in and of itself, not so much. Applying it afterwards and the learnings that you get, that's where I can actually put systems in place to make sure I'm accounting for my blind spots by talking to somebody who has very different blind spots than I do.
Mm-hmm. And just to clarify that, sorry.
I found that if you have a group of people and you do an assessment with a group of people, and then you, after an hour or two of educating them and having them experiment and understand more about different people and how they think themselves and comparing themselves to others in their group, and then breaking the group into subgroups and having a smaller group, a department, then, okay, what are the problems that this department is facing? What are the opportunities? And who's got ideas on how this department could operate and overcome some of these hurdles that a number of people have spoken. Almost everyone agrees that this and this and this are problems. Now let's look at these problems again. And they come in with fresh eyes frequently. And they're able to be creative and innovative, and they don't write each other off in quite the same manner. And there are breakthroughs that are possible.
Just a comment, that was excellent on everybody's part. Since these different stylistic measurements exist, we didn't focus on that stuff at all. They are great for their purpose, and you get to know whether or not I can relate to someone, if you will. Neil and I actually remember Neil's is mine, quite honestly, but we relate to each other. But going beyond relating, coming back to decisions and saying, let me peer in your mind, or that delegate's mind, or the subordinate's mind, or the subordinate's mind, or the subordinate's mind, whoever it is, saying, how is this thinking being done? Some people rise to a manager level and don't actually know how to do critical thinking. But if we peer into the mind and we're able to open it up and see and make that visible, and there's specific visuals I can paint in your mind, but beyond today, it's like, oh, that's how you're making that decision for that one topic, not the second topic, but that one topic. If I add one more variable to that equation, that may jog everything. But then how do I make it nice and clear again? Because otherwise, if I don't have it clear, I have a process for thinking that's out of control. And then I do not have a process for speaking that is in control. And so it's about this process of thinking, critical thinking, even if we have fear, Don, right? That's an excellent point of the fear, because I agree 100% with everything you said. How do we reduce the fear? Show me the evidence kind of thing, right? You have to show me the evidence, but in a way that I can say, this makes sense to me. Otherwise, let's say I showed you the evidence, you're like, sorry, I don't get it yet. You rightfully should challenge me in this case and say, what's the problem? And I didn't have that perspective. I had a blind spot. You helped me fill that blind spot, but with data. You're like, Larry, I would do it this way. I'm like, oh, interesting. Okay. So maybe like in my thinking process, call it a 2-minute thinking process, about a minute, 20 seconds in, you're like, you were good up to that point, but then you lost me and the rest is kind of junk. So now if you, what have you done? And you're like, well, I would have just slightly changed the variable this way. I'm like, okay, you know the rest of the path going forward. I get knocked out of the equation, all due respect, right? I'm like, say, everybody please speak to Don because he knows you're talking about this area. I'm not an expert in that area, no matter where I am in the totem pole. It's like, you got to speak to Don about this stuff because he's had the expertise. He knows how to execute. Again, strategy to execution, and he knows how to arrive at outcomes. So he's the one who should be respecting this discussion around those kind of things.
So imagine this, because this is what we're talking about, is that when you hire employees in the business, you're hiring their ability to make sense of things. They're not there to go and just to give a gut feeling. They're here to give logic, understanding, objectivity and stuff. So take that sense-making process in the mind, bring it out to software for everybody. So you move from a mental model into a mental framework that's consistent and institutionalized. And you have componentry in there that everybody can use for their own unique roles, which makes it very strong in a cerebral and competitive advantage. So the whole area of cognition hasn't been explored yet in the area of software, but this is a very, very important piece of it, because this is the next landscape for competition. The transactional works, it's like you say, well, I have SAP, well, I have SAP too, and how great SAP really is, but it's like, it's been pretty ubiquitous now as far as that type of technology that's out there. So what are you competing on right now? Your human capital, your human resources that need to be resourceful. So let's leverage this capability. Let's get people to get to a new advanced state. Let's get people to not be so transactional in a thought process or a gut feeling. Let's get them focused on outcomes, thinking through critically, thinking through those outcomes, and then going further and thinking across perspectives and engaging, as Larry's talked about in the beginning of the discussion, on which stakeholder do I need to really engage here, because they may see things differently, and it's important that they leverage my knowledge so they can make the best decision. So to Don's point about stress, what if there's a family situation at home, you got 2 hours sleep, you come in, it's like yeah, okay, and you can't really think very well. People don't know your family situation, but you need to make sure that you're still abiding by your responsibilities because you're accountable for it at work. So as a result, if you're using a process, a framework, an infrastructure to make sense of things, that people can, in a positive way challenge you, which is good because that means the decision cycle goes through once, versus over and over again. You don't have that inefficiency, that waste. We talked about decision waste. You actually the wisdom process doesn't happen when you're just 80 or 90. You're pushing it back in time so you can get it much earlier because you're actually using frameworks to do it in a consistent way. You maintain your creativity, the way you look at things, that's fantastic. We talk about this thing called interpretive encoding, which means that you can look at information because you have the expertise, But if I look at it, I would have no clue what you're talking about because I don't have your subject matter expertise. So in itself, there's an interpretive encoding built into how you work with this mind-machine partnership with software frameworks built for thinking and communication. Sorry, John, I think you're on mute.
You mentioned outcomes earlier, and that was one thing I was always coached about, was to start with the end in mind and work backwards to where you are now, right? Which I think, it forces you into a process approach to thinking, what had to happen before the outcome and what led to that step and that step all the way back to where you are now. I guess I'm asking, is that kind of what you were referring to in the approach to outcomes?
Yes, there's a duality of profiles in our system that work together at the same time. So, for example, you have the current state that you know really well because you live in it, and the future state. That's one example of many. Of let's say there's like over 9 or so use cases specifically for our profiles itself, and this is goal management. So looking at for goal management itself, it's current and future state. How do you the human has to get involved between the two states to resolve that knowledge gap, right? So, but if you can actually visualize both thought processes in the current and future states, well, okay, I don't want to end up quite there, or I do want to end up in a future state. What do we need to do to accomplish that? And start to engineer your outcomes and get everybody on the same page around that.
Frank, the challenge is though, if it's a static situation, you can define the outcomes pretty clearly, but when it becomes dynamic, it gets very challenging. So our brains may be able to handle static situations and back into it, depending on how much our brains can maintain and recall, and the next day wake up and recall that same image in our minds. When it's dynamic, 2, 3, 5 people may not be able to handle it. It need to systematize that. It's like really challenging for us to actually manage all those complexities, such as COVID.
Yeah.
But it doesn't have to be as big as COVID. That's on a humongous macro scale we're going to relate to, and there's this micro scale, if I can call it that, still macro probably, in every organization pretty much of what's going on.
What's happening now with all of the supply chain issues that are going on, and everybody's having to, rethink, recalculate, recalibrate on a daily basis based on what they think they're going to get delivered. And that's the dynamic one that I would say is a pretty present example.
Right.
Yeah.
And who's going to show up to work?
Yeah. Right. And how to get them back into work. Right.
The combination of, and then what's going on with their customers, and this, not only the deliveries, but what's the sustainability of their vendors?
Right.
Yeah.
So, but John, a really important point you make there is about engagement. With this great resignation going on right now, you start saying, how do I get people to stay? How do I get them to engage? And it's about deep human learning. It's about feeling I can contribute. It's about the diversity of mind and thinking in an agile way, and inclusion. I want to be included. I want to be part of the decision process. I want to know that my thoughts matter. If I'm under this culture that doesn't make me feel that way, or this manager or management, it's like I'm going to maybe consider leading with the pack.
Yes. Who is my tribe? Who is my tribe? Can I trust these people? Is this my future? Is this my family? Because it gets almost, it gets very primitive. What is the feeling? Am I respected and honored? Am I safe?
John, you mentioned something else, John, about the supply chain. You and I have talked about this over the years too, is that how do you manage one node away supplier 2 nodes away, 3 nodes, et cetera, that are actually going to impact you, if not about the transactional work, because you can visualize, you get the MRP, MPS, whatever it may be, coming, you get the planning coming to you. You can see that stuff. But what about the decisions, how they're being made? How about the critical thinking by that fourth node, if you can go to that fourth node and get visibility, how do you manage that? Because if they do something wrong, right, call it a logistics company, for instance, just to make it visual in your mind, just shipping product. Product's one thing. We can see what happens if the product gets damaged or not. It has to be reproduced, if you will. But decisions are a product that gets generated. But if you're a stakeholder, I'm a stakeholder, that someone down the line, how do I make sure I see what's going on and put controls into those processes, neural management controls, so I can make sure when I get that, if I can properly define that, right? I think it's a huge opportunity for consultants to define this for people. If I get there, then it comes back to me. I'm like, oh my God, I just got impacted. How do I manage that? Well, we're all getting managed because it's not product, it's decisions, a different kind of product, but it's not necessarily layer one, or rather in a circle, if you will. It's beyond that in a circle.
What a fascinating conversation, gentlemen and ladies. Thank you for a very, very stimulating discussion.